visitors, especially further away, is all from China. Is Tong Wang, listed here, and our second participant. She'll tell you a little bit about her individually, separately. But Tong Wang was here for I guess a year.
Yeah.
Did a master's degree in the MAPS program and a thesis on nightlife and scenes in China, and he's now then he spent 2 years in Beijing coordinating the Scenes Academy, and it started out as people like this in a table, and in December it had 1.4 million, so you see what he can do. So he'll tell you a little bit about how that happened.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe that's the best way to introduce.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Okay.
So please taste it. When we can have discussion. We'll see where and how this goes, but let's keep a discussion mode and informality, and not just make it a fixed something that's done. But this is very much in progress, and it's changing, and he's been active. I'll let you tell him about tell you about what he did, and get a sense. And I guess I'm just suggesting, given this kind of informality and the flexibility and the self-expression that you yourself brought to this, along with the 3 other organizers. It was Dan Silver and myself, but the people who led were not the 2 of us. The 3 were 3 Chinese, 3 Chinese young scholars who'd all been in Chicago, and they then, with the inspiration of Qi, of the idea of the French salon, she called it initially a salon, and they still use that term for the monthly meetings, but then there's an annual meeting called the summit. But where this fits together is what you'll see some interesting things. So let's
Okay.
go ahead.
Thanks, Professor. Yeah. So hi, everybody. Pleasure to be here. I'm Tong Wang. I'm doing my PhD at the University of Toronto in the Department of Sociology. Did my MA here with Professor Clark, and went home to China for 2 years building a academic network called Scenes Academy in China. So today I'm just going to give you a short overview of recent scenes work in China and related projects that I participated in. So here's the outline. So we'll first discuss some introductory stuff about the scenes as part of a new Chicago school tradition on a book project that we're working on. Then I'll introduce the dramatic expansion of scenes research in China. Then I'll talk some more about scenes policies and urban development in China, and end with an overview of activities and contributions of the Scenes China Academy. Okay, so the new Chicago School and scenes. So I guess I'll just give a quick introduction of the theory of scenes. I'm not sure if you've read it in the syllabus yet, but it was initially developed by Tara Nicholas Clark and Daniel Aaron Silver as part of a new Chicago School of Urban Research. So it is situated in the general background in the post-industrial city, the post-industrial society, where culture, arts, and aesthetics have become increasingly important in urban life. And the idea of a scene is generally defined as a symbolic, meaningful space of cultural consumption. It is a combination of several elements: the neighborhood, the shops, the establishments, amenities, the people there, the values, and the activities that goes on in the place. And it is essentially the aesthetic and cultural feel of a place that brings people together and drives certain urban dynamics and processes. And here you see the Scenescapes, the 2016 book. It demonstrates that in the US context, We understand that scenes are redefining the modes of urban development, economic development, residential patterns, as well as political activism and public policy. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the idea of the Chicago School, or the old Chicago School of Urban Research, especially the seminal work of Park and Burgess, the city. So the concept of the new Chicago School, that was first introduced by Terry Clark. In 2008, he published Program for a New Chicago School Research Project in the Journal of Urban Geography. And this was later evolved into scenes theory. In 2018, he published this key recent progress of scenes research with Carrie Wu and others in the Journal of Urban Studies. So in contrast to the old Chicago School tradition, the new Chicago School is more of a offers a more flexible scale of analysis of scenes than the more community, neighborhood-based urban studies of Park and Burgess with the old Chicago School. So in terms of the analytic approach, the new Chicago School adopts a more explicit, comprehensive, culture-oriented, and integrated approach as opposed to the original human ecology approach. Oh.
I'm just pointing to Carrie Wu, is the first author. He was here for a couple of years, and at the beginning he could not get a visa. So I think more than 2 years he was in Beijing. He did a BA, and then he was working on an MA at Renmin University. It's a leading and policy-oriented national government university. He then said he'd like to participate in some of the scenes meetings that we were holding. I said, how did you know about this? I mean, he wasn't here. All this came from Beijing. Yeah. And I said, so we had things that like Skype and so forth. And he said, well, Beijing is changing. And I said, well, give me some examples of how big Beijing is changing with new things. And his first example was, what do you think he mentioned, or might have mentioned? People are walking their dogs together and arguing about whether or not they should be permitted to clean up after them, or whether the police or the sanitation department or someone else should shepherd them to do this. Okay, consumption, lifestyle, nothing about Mao or so he and at this point, this was before we even had the concept of scene. That is, we talked about social issues and lifestyle things as so he'd come across this, of seeing this in Beijing, reading about it and saying, I want to find out about the people doing this, and he came to us. He couldn't get a visa for at least 3 years or something like that.
Wow.
So he participated in our meetings. We never met in person, online, and he was coming up with new ideas, including this paper. And he now has tenure at York University in Canada as a very successful guy. So, Tom, go ahead.
Yes.
By urban geography, do you mean the same thing as scenes?
No, that's the name of a journal.
The journal.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. So based on these key ideas on the new Chicago School, I've worked on a book project with Professor Jun Wu, Dan Silver, and Terry Clark over the past few years, which is very close to fruition. We have a tentative cover here. So its key objectives, it's like a companion volume of Scenescapes, which was published in 2016. So its key objectives are 3. So to provide more of an academic context for the scenes ideas and scenes theory that is somewhat under-discussed in the original Scenescapes books, especially the tradition of scenes ideas in the traditional Chicago School sociology and urban studies, as well as the group of new Chicago Schools scholars that have gathered around Professor Clark in 2000s, as well as the later innovations and inheritance through scenes research in 2010s. And second, reviews the past 5 decades of debates in international urban research, especially the sort of debates among urban schools, the Chicago School, the LA School, New York School, and then the eventual integration and synergy from the New Chicago perspective, call to go beyond schoolism towards a more general framework of analysis and comparison, not sort of restricted to one city as a model for all, but a more general framework. And third, it looks at the frontiers and future directions of international scenes research. Some of these include virtual scenes, international comparison of scenes, evolution of scenes ideas, and especially more innovations in China, which we'll touch on later. So, scenes research in China. Over the past decade or so, scenes research has experienced exponential growth in China. And this development could be partially attributed to the extraordinary urbanization, increasingly important role of innovation, culture and consumption, Professor mentioned, in urban life. As you can see in the figure on the right here, the academic articles under the keyword scenes theory have grown so rapidly in China. More than 300 papers and theses published in over the last decade. And these publications span a wide range of fields, including sociology, urban studies, cultural industries, planning, management and governance, and the arts. And looking at the recent Chinese scenes literature, we find four major orientations. First, the scenes and urban development mechanisms, with the more representative studies of Wu Jun and others on amenity-driven urban development, community youth well-being scenes, and consumption scenes. And second, on scenes and urban planning or urban renewal. Some representative works include work on urban community renewal in Chengdu, as well as study on urban street renewals in the mountainous areas of Chongqing City, both sort of southwestern areas of China. They're very actively pursuing scenes-driven policies and placemaking ideas. And thirdly, scenes and cultural industry, or cultural policy in general. These are based on works in the National Communication University in Beijing, by Qiji and Qiran, the work on, say, the buzz power of scenes, as well as in Wuhan, Chenbo's study on the rural cultural space, virtual cultural scenes, etc. So delving a little bit deeper on the policy side, so in addition to these developments in academic research and theory, Chinese scenes researchers are particularly interested in applying scenes ideas to policy and pursuing practical application of scenes ideas into China's rapidly developing urban cities, urban developments, especially in the areas of placemaking, innovation, policy innovation, planning, etc. So scenes innovations in China, there have been various conceptual innovations along the lines of scenes, such as consumption scenes, the idea of scenes making, like placemaking, and scenes city making and scene city. And most importantly, in the Chinese political context, for the first time, the concept of scenes has been officially adopted in the 14th Chinese National 5-Year Plan. And this is basically published every 5 years as a sort of the most important national level document that outlines the political, economic, social objectives for the nation going forward. So it's a big deal. And it's important to note that this is also the first 5-year plan without an explicit GDP growth target. And it signifies China's overall policy shift towards high quality development and a beautiful life away from the more production, economic-driven economy. And specifically, scenes was added in this plan as part of culture and lifestyle, local innovation, community development, respectively as 3 types of scenes: consumption scenes, future tech application scenes, and community service scenes. And following the release of this 5-year plan in March 2021, 8 cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Chongqing, have already issued and implemented related scenes-oriented policies. And now I'd like to introduce a prime example of that, scenes city making in the city of Chengdu. So this is the world's first scenes-oriented urban policy agenda in China, the southwest city of Chengdu. So it's well known for its Sichuan cuisine, its hot pot and giant pandas, but now also for its beautiful scenes.
Giant pandas. See,
Yes, the
think of that.
pandas, yeah. And from 2020 and 2022, we paid several visits to Chengdu to investigate these efforts, including fieldwork, interviews with local officials, seminars, and multiple municipal and district agencies. And since 2017, the city of Chengdu has begun to incorporate scenes ideas into its overall policy design and systematically apply the idea of scenes making to the city's production, consumption, and governance. So on a more micro level, scenes making seeks to stimulate the casual, comfortable quality of Chengdu's culture, called it 烟火气. It's like the local culture, the local lifestyle of everyday life. 巴士安逸 is like this idea of laid back, comfortable kind of style of life, and to transform these cultural values into an actual concrete experience and incorporate it into urban spaces through the idea of scenes. And on a more macro level, it seeks to create a scenes system, the continuous creation of these different types of scenes across the city, and the superposition between the scenes to eventually realize a vision of a scenes city. So the details on the scene city making in Chengdu, some more case studies can be found in a new book just published last year on scene city making. Unfortunately, it's in Chinese. But the scenes exploration in Chengdu's top-level policy took several stages. From the introduction, 2017, the first idea of application scenes, the seven application scenes, related more to technology, application, new economic forms. And 2019, initially the idea of 8 consumption scenes, about implementing the idea of a new development concept, accelerating construction, international consumption center city, both sort of the more top-level agendas in China, but they've sort of concretized them and boiled them down to the idea of consumption scenes and trying to encourage more consumption, cultural activities, and arts in the neighborhoods. And 7 community scenes, and this is part of the overall plan for the development and governance of urban and rural communities in Chengdu. And eventually, the 6 park scenes, the urban planning of beautiful and livable city, of livable park city, which is the vision of a more ecological friendly and sort of moving away from a more industrial, economic driven type of city. And among those, and integrating those, is a framework of scenes city making in Chengdu. And we have 4 major components: the application scenes, the connection revolution brought by the science, technology, new technologies, new ways of stimulating economic growth; consumption scenes, the new consumer culture and lifestyles; community scenes, social interaction and community cohesiveness; and park scenes, more diversified style of transformation of ecological values, leading towards more scenes-oriented development of the city of Chengdu. And several important organizational innovations was a key aspect of this entire scene city making endeavor, because we understand scenes making as a very highly multidimensional, specific to local contexts. And the city created 3 new agencies that are also the first of its kind to overcome the inertia and bottlenecks of the traditional government agencies. So yes, these 3 agencies are also first of their kind in China to coordinate, facilitate multi-sectorial and departmental collaboration, to establish more dynamic top-down and bottom-up sort of more dynamic integration of these 2 types of processes, and more central local linkages and policy design implementation at the municipal level. So the new Economic Development Commission, the Community Development and Governance Commission, and the Park City Administration Bureau, each sort of responsible for a different type of scenes as we see before. And to give you an overall sense of the progress of scene city making in Chengdu, here's a scene city making innovation map released in August 2022, and it systematically summarizes and refines the experience of Chengdu's scenes innovations over the past 5 years. And as you can see, it lists all these locations across the entire area of Chengdu, and the types of scenes that are being constructed already already constructed across these separate places. And in this interactive map, you can actually click on all of these icons and look at what types of scenes or what are the more representative ones in each of these clusters. So we see that Chengdu has experienced rapid development since the application of scenes ideas and scenes city making. And you see here for some of the stats, most dramatically, during China's Spring Festival Week of 2021, and this was during the pandemic, the number of tourists to Chengdu nearly tripled megacities like Beijing and Shanghai, which are very well known, as shown here on the chart on the left. If we look here on the annual growth of tourism over time, Chengdu has consistently exhibited a higher rate of growth than Beijing and Shanghai, and even surpassing Beijing temporarily in 2020, despite the impact of the COVID pandemic.
Any guesstimate of the population size of Chengdu?
Not off the top of my head, but it's smaller than Beijing and Shanghai.
But it's probably bigger than New York.
Absolutely, yes.
It's absolutely bigger than New York.
We can look it up in Google here.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So the point is,
Since 2019, 16.33 million.
okay, 16 million people there.
And how many in Beijing?
21.54
Okay,
million.
see these are
2018.
these are, if you put London, Paris, New York, Rome, all together, this is equal to one of these. See, these are huge places. Okay.
Yeah, these are called mega cities, I think, in China's statistical
And
yearbook.
there are no
Yeah.
mega cities in Europe or the U.S. They're in, okay, go ahead.
Professor Clark talked about consumption, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And you're talking about this consumption that is being developed, yeah, through shops, yeah, and stuff like that. My question is, how is big tech companies like Amazon playing a role in this scenes development?
That's a great question. I think you're referring to, I guess, the virtual scenes of these virtual platforms that are connecting the consumers and the shops and the experiences that are happening on the
More people
streets.
buying online and not buying in the small shops. Is that happening or not?
It is happening. But what is happening on the streets are also growing. I think through the pandemic, footfall have decreased a lot, but I think afterwards there's a great rebound of that. People coming out more on the streets. As you can see, like this stats actually, the Spring Festival Week of 2021, it is actually one of the few weeks or the first major public holiday where the government has lifted the ban, the COVID ban to leave
That is a
Leave
food
the house.
festival. People eat.
Uh,
That's a food festival.
a Spring Festival. It's like Christmas in the West, so it's like the major yearly celebration, the biggest holiday.
Do you
in
eat a lot outside? Like the Spaniards and Italians, they eat a lot outside their houses. Is that the same in China?
Yeah, we do, yes. Going out to eat hot pots and stuff, yeah. It's a big part, yeah. So, to wrap things up, I'd like to talk about the Scenes China Academy. I know the professor has mentioned. So it is a very key research network in China that has provided crucial support for our China-related, China-based scenes research, and also active participants in multiple international projects. So the Scenes Academy is this research network co-founded by leading scenes researchers across 5 universities in China and across the world. So as you can see here, Professor Clark, University of Chicago, Dan Silver, University of Toronto, and Jude, Beijing Administration Institute, Bochen from Wuhan, and Qiji from Communication University of China. So it covers actually a lot of ground, and we constantly have new participants coming in, and just at the year of 2021, we have over 150 active participants from over 20 institutions in China, but also across the world. So we founded the Scenes Academy, this network, through the first Scenes China Summit in July 2020. And as you can see, this is the screenshot of our first summit. It was the height of the pandemic, so it was online, and people are on the screen here in front of the cameras and smiling. And yes, so I have been a key participant and coordinator for these activities for 2 years, from 2020 to 2022. And over these years, we've held 36 online research meetings on various research projects, student thesis, PhD, MA thesis, as well as theoretical and methodological discussions on scenes research. Here are some of the posters for our past activities, past events. So we've held 6 academic dialogues and 2 annual summits on various scenes-related topics, including placemaking, community governance, cultural development, social innovation, research methodology, etc. And we've invited speakers from 12 universities in China, and also organizations and government agencies, reaching hundreds of thousands across China. And our members have participated in 10 national level research projects and published 25 research articles, as well as 3 book series over this time. Yes, again, same stuff. Some of the illustration of one of our major book series, Urban Renewal with Culture. This is led by Qiji at the Communication University of China. A series of student PhDs and MAs on different aspects of scenes. And some of, this is in Chinese, sorry, but some of the topics, the titles of academic research of articles I've published over the years. So some, for instance, this one on virtual museum scenes, some on non-tangible inheritance, cultural inheritance scenes, stuff like that, Bohemian cultural scenes. Again, it covers a very wide range of topics, and this is consistent with the scenes theory and the idea of sort of facilitating this more interdisciplinary and more open perspective towards the study of cities, instead of sort of limiting to one perspective, one framework of one city. And yes, this is my presentation for today. So thanks for listening, and we have the QR codes for our international projects and our Chinese scenes research project. Yep, Professor, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, no, well,
Thank you.
Indeed, and you personally did play a major role in really making this happen in
Yeah,
ways
small
that-
role.
but I mean that's the sort of the big. But there was one title there in English. What if you just say a few words about how, in this one example of a English published paper with maybe 5 or so co-authors. I don't know if you have anything about it. So it's called Bohemian Cultural Scenes, but it's a good illustration of the multiple types of data, methods, linking of ideas, and then testing them with something that which the Chinese have done more than we've done elsewhere. They went first to social media. They didn't start with the census. They didn't start just with ethnography of one neighborhood, as has been done for 50 years. They said, let's go to the internet. Let's code these scenes from the internet, and counted these things. But how about telling us a little bit about, because I mean you in the English part, I mean I know you did a lot of the writing yourself, of putting these pieces together. So tell us a little bit about how this publication, you yourself, what led in doing that?
Yes. Well, yes. Like you said, it's an analysis of social media data. It's actually the most influential social media and commenting platform. It's like Yelp in the Western context. It's called Dianping, 大众点评, and I think we collected data for 65 cities, and I think we did cluster analysis of these different amenities and coded these clusters, the way they congregated geographically across the cities, and we coded them based on the scenes dimensions from scenes theory. And I was a late participant in the project, and it was led by Professor Wu Jun at Beijing Institute of Administration with his MA student. So they were already collecting this big data set and doing the initial analysis. I sort of came in later and understood the methodologies and added more of a, I guess, more comparative perspective from what I learned in Chicago, and sort of I guess combining the quantitative analyses of these amenities across these regions with more subtle qualitative interpretations from the scenes theory, as in sort of tradition, authenticity, self-expression, and what do these different clusters mean in the context of the scenes theory, and eventually, I think after a couple rounds of submission, rejection, and we eventually got it published at, I think, sustainability, it was my first publication, and working together with these scholars, and also with Professor Clark giving us valuable feedback towards many aspects of it. It's been a long time, so I don't recall all the details, but that's a gist of it. Yeah.
But I'll just add to it, or maybe you can elaborate.
Mm-hmm.
How did you include one city of Chengdu?
How do we?
You have lots of examples from Chengdu included in that journal paper. I'm saying this in part because we have discussions even in the sociology department. Should we have multiple regression only? Should we have ethnography only? Should we have archival methods of working in historical museums or archival sources? And my answer is, let's do them all and put them all together, because they each have their limitations. And you did this here, but you took material from Chengdu with one case in China to illustrate. So instead of having, this term bohemian, when I first went to Asia, Korea, China, Japan, and I said something about bohemian, and in each of the three countries, people would say, "What's bohemian mean?" They never heard of it.
That's the Czech Republic.
Well, yes, but that's one meaning.
Yeah.
But the second meaning is, that's an important point, but that is the idea of a literary, cultural, and political, somewhat challenging in Balzac, Baudelaire, and others, the Montmartre neighborhood under Balzac, and then later on the Latin scene, the Latin Quarter, so-called, has been, and then in New York, the Greenwich Village kind of archetypical image. But now you have a little bohemian scene in, hundreds of American cities now have these. And so what they did was to take some dimensions in these 65 cities and measured how would you compare the different 65 cities within China that would capture something about bohemianism.
I think we did the clustering of amenities, the different clusters of amenities in cities, and we had a typology of I think northern versus southern cities, western versus eastern cities, and these different cities have sort of different combinations or different topologies of these clusters of amenities. And by coding the clusters, we were able to sort of apply the scene's dimensions and the scene's ideas through these different topologies of cities, these different city regions. And I think eventually we ended up using Chengdu as a case of illustrating the southern southwest kind of case there. I don't remember the exact dimensions that we used, but I think it's more sort of self-expression, less traditional stuff like that, and combining with the scenes making efforts in Chengdu that we were actually actively engaging studying at the time, and also adding a more policy perspective that we're not just studying a phenomenon, we are interpreting it, but it's also being actively created, being actively sort of engaged with by policymakers, by local practitioners in these places, and Chengdu is a prime example of that. So sort of, it's a good sort of case to tie up, I guess, the theoretical ideas of the scenes how it relates, how it features in the local development, creative development, but also sort of how it also features in the, I guess, the policy agenda and ongoing efforts by the government, not just in Chengdu, but Chongqing and Beijing and Shanghai, etc. Yeah.
In the first year, and then went into the second year when you were really active there, we had continual discussions about how do these 15 dimensions work and how can they be conceptualized and measured for China. And so we went through each one, so we debated about whether or not we should try to do this over Zoom or something like that with as many as 30 or 50 people all
Yes.
talking together about these kinds of things. And Dan Silver joined us for a bit, and he said, "This is crazy. We should have 3 or 4 people, and they ought to pull it together."
Yeah. Yes.
And then you did that. And so the 3 or 4 people, led by Tong Wang right here, you managed to do this. And the raw data, just to sort of, where do we get raw data? They were things like counting the numbers of amenities, calling them, giving them the term amenity from economics. It's not something you pay for in a market. It's something which may be free, but you can still see them and count them online, such as a physical park or a cafe, a restaurant, a church, or a Buddhist temple. And then the numbers of these can be counted by neighborhood and by city and compared, and those in turn you can aggregate up, and those can measure each of these 15 dimensions. So I'm just mentioning the raw data. And so, as in the U.S. and in the Scenescapes book, we didn't do this with data from the internet. We used what's called BizZip, which is in China and France and other countries, they're called industrial categories of firms, or including restaurants, cafes, operas. These are all listed in part because these governments want to collect fees and taxes, and so they follow, and financially they want to know how many people they employ, how much money they collect, and then how much they pay in tax. And so they follow these very carefully. But the nice thing for research is that they have the same categories in France, in Spain, and in China, and we have ready-made by government and accounting people who've done this internationally, so you can compare these things. So is this economics? No. You see, we're using it to measure cultural, meaningfully, emotionally important dimensions. So people say, how can you use economic data to do that? No, we just did it. Okay. But when you then go to the internet and have the Yelp type data, you can also have what does the Yelp site post by the manager of the restaurant, and say, we serve this kind of food, we have this kind of service, and you can then code the words, and so we've done this for different cities. And so we have New York, London, Toronto, and London had a number of more. London and New York had places that were more, they used words like cool, fun, challenging, that is emotionally but also slightly breaking the rules of the simple square kind of institutions, whereas Chicago had many fewer of those, as measured by the self-defined statements of the managers of the restaurants, and I think we used mostly restaurants, maybe restaurants, cafes, whatever. And so we've elaborated these with other kinds of field work. So we had a conference. It was I won't go on to too much except I'm pointing out the engagement with all of the participants to try to capture. And so a continual question by the Chinese was, how is this different in China? We want to articulate and capture this specifically. And so one thing which we talked about was, and we were working together as well on a book that eventually got the published title of Can Tocqueville Karaoke? And so can this father of American value analysis, Tocqueville, and where did he generate? So he did not talk about, and here we go. Tocqueville did not talk about things like restaurants or cafes, and he didn't really trace the sources, and that he had a little bit. He compared with France to say France is this way, America is that way. Mm-hmm. But later people like Putnam or Lipset, I would add, did not tend to go back to the European sources and try to do this. Elazar has done so. So Elazar's on our reading list, as you know. Elazar, so Lipset's frequent normal characterization, he tended to use national data, national citizen survey data, national voting, national elections for the president over history. And Vildovsky tended to do the same. But Elazar, by contrast, would go down to the local area, and within the U.S. he mapped and he gave scores to 3,000 counties, often taking data from local linguists who had studied a particular accent, in Cook County compared to Will County and things of that sort. So to try to get a sense of this for the Chinese, we looked for amenities that we could count and identify that we could also see in the words like karaoke, and where and how was karaoke used. And one of the biggest, best survey studies. Well, there's lots of it. One thing we did in our Scenes Academy meetings, we reviewed everything we could find in cafes and restaurants, but also karaoke, and how was karaoke used all around the world. And then where and how this could be potentially connected with the Tocquevillian personal interactions of various. I don't want to try to elaborate too much, but just to say for one example, which I'm not sure if it was you or who brought this in our discussion. If you think of the American city in an interesting, unusual, cartoon way, Superman is sometimes he's a newspaper reporter named Clark Kent, and when Clark Kent has a need for Superman, he would get into it. Used to be a telephone booth and change his clothes. He'd take his shirt off in the telephone booth and then come out and it's Superman. Well, today you have this in Beijing and in other places. It looks like a telephone booth where you could change your clothes, but what's it for?
Oh, it's a karaoke booth. It's a mini karaoke, yeah.
Okay, so tell the other. See, they've never heard of this, and I had never heard of this before. It's in China, but it's a measure of something which is powerful in a Chinese city, totally unknown in the rest of the world. But tell us just a little bit more about a karaoke booth.
Yeah, well, it's actually not that new. It's been around for maybe a few years, 5 years or something. But it's I think you find it a lot in airports when people waiting for flights when they're mad about like the flight delays and stuff, and you have these like little booths and it's like soundproof, so it's private, and like people go in like one or two. I've done it with my girlfriend multiple times. We just go into a booth and we sing and we have a good time, and people outside don't know what we're doing, and it's like a private little space, but it's karaoke, and it's inside an airport, which is not typically sort of where a lot of entertainment activities going on, but it is. But that's the gist of it, and it's.
Does it have windows?
It's a clear, it's a glass booth,
That's
so
a
you
glass
can see
booth.
stuff outside. But it's totally soundproof, so people can see you like singing like crazy, but they can't hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
So you're putting yourself out there for public consumption in a way, so people are seeing you enjoy. Yeah. Mhm.
How these scenes influence tourism? Because you talk about tourism over there. Is that local tourism or is this foreign tourism?
Both.
Both.
Yes. So yeah, I guess it's what the I think maybe Professor you talked about this, the different models of urban development from sort of the more traditional industrial type when you have land, labor, and capital driving towards human capital, and then sort of scenes and amenities enter as an intervening factor. It's sort of what channels the human capital or what attracts the human capital and sort of gathers them in the way of tourism or in the ways of sort of even keeping them around or changing their location of work or residence. I think, Professor, you in the urban policy analysis class, you were using this example where like how many of you would move to Chicago versus a small town, like given the same wage or even paying more in a small town, and you should.
Yeah, I don't think we did this in this class. Okay, no, but we can try it here. It's just a very simple, quantitative, but you can do it ethnographically, or let's say, how many of you, if you graduated or had a degree, and if we have, say, college students or MA students, if you were offered to have a job where it would be the same job in two locations, it could either be in Chicago or be in a small town of about 5,000 in North Dakota, and if you go to North Dakota, you would be paid $100,000 a year. If you stay in Chicago, you would be paid half, $50,000. How many of you would take the job in North Dakota?
How many years in North Dakota?
If we add, say, 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah. How many of you would raise your hand and say North Dakota? No.
Yeah. You go there.
There you go.
Okay. Typically at the USC, I would say for 15 years, we had either none or maybe one. I don't know why, but about 3 or 4 years ago, about a third of the students said they would go to North Dakota. Then we then went to them one by one and said, why would you go to North Dakota? The people who chose that. And maybe a third of them said they wanted to have more money, but the reason they would want to be able to pay off their student loans. But they also would say, if I can have the funds, I would be able to do things more, that is, I could live a better lifestyle with the funds, and it was not as if they would, okay, so it would be a mixed kind of, and then the third kind of answer would be, I prefer the small town. I want to do mountain biking, I want to live in the forests, I want to do skiing, and I don't like big cities. So I'd also say this is simultaneously a measure of the changes in the student culture and the types of students coming to the University of Chicago, which in those same years we had been maybe 8th or something like that compared to all the other top universities and top colleges in the U.S. in rankings by the U.S. News and World Report used to do this. In those years, we became essentially the same as Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And so that is, the students in terms of academic background, college board scores, etc., the number of places that they applied to, the numbers of applications, all of that. The U.S. that is, within the U.S., the University of Chicago became tops. and I don't know, I would say maybe students who are a little more self-confident and who would also come from, I don't know, I can't, I won't try to elaborate in detail. There's a Chinese woman here now. She's trying to study the culture of colleges and universities, and to compare and to look at how to do this in China, but to take the U.S. research on these. And this has been a big theme which has been done here at NORC, but also by Edward James Coleman, Charles Bidwell, and others and then there were ethnographic studies of Chicago public schools in detail. So in a sense, these can be some of the answers to your question of where and how do you get from people through amenities and karaoke booths, leading to getting better at your karaoke, leading in term to maybe, I don't know if this changes, but either whether that makes you higher or lower in your job, maybe not, but maybe you're considered the best karaoke singer in everybody in this office, even if he's not good at computer programming. And so maybe they then say, well, maybe there's certain things which he's really that is, take say one kind of finding we have, Brazil. With Dan Silver's working with a Brazilian.
Thiago Silva.
Brazilian. Brazil and Latin America have some of the lowest trust in the world. 15% of the people say, can you trust the national president? Can you trust the police? Can you trust the military? And about 10 or 15% say you can trust them. And Mexico is visibly, with gangsters, etc. Lots of people are kidnapped all the time. On the other hand, if you ask the question, how happy are you? Brazil is something like 80%. They're much happier. Poor Brazilians say they're much happier than are Americans or Swedes or others, high educated, low educated, and so forth. So where to put these together has not been, I would say, or that I've asked this and told this among Brazilians, and they said, we need to work on it further. We don't really understand it very well. Okay. Yes.
Could you please explain to us why, for example, the scenes of the European cities and the scenes of Brazil and Portugal, attract more tourism, like Paris, Madrid, Milano, than the American than the American cities here? Where do we see these scenes?
Good question. Well, for sure, and this is not new. These go back for elite. If we go back, many of the scenes, many things we talk about in scenes have existed for hundreds of years, but the change in the late 20th century is the explosion of these. And so part of this, I'd say, is more education and more money and more professional jobs, where you're expected not to do the work of a machine, but instead to think. And a professional, as a doctor, a lawyer, a social worker, a judge, you need to think through more creatively, and that in turn is, if you think of living and doing your work in that way, it's not, it's likely that this is, well, one thing we talked about even here today, some of the young people in China who are university educated, and I don't know what the numbers are, but I mean, there are many Chinese are now going to universities. Well, so the U.S. with the land-grant universities, I mean, Lipset's, one of Lipset's favorite answers was, the Europeans say the welfare state was created by Bismarck and by the English in the 20th, over the slow growth of the 20th century. The state of Massachusetts created common required education for everyone about 1820, 1830, which is 50 years before Bismarck. The American Massachusetts welfare state was giving people education. Then they could decide how to use, how to be themselves, what kind of work they might do, instead of saying, here's the money, and so that the related concepts, which we have more abstractly, in terms of the idea of the welfare state, is is not to measure the say the percentage of people who have cars, or the percentage, even the percentage of this percentage of, say, of black people who are going to a university and saying this is a good university, or a discriminating anti-black university. So that's one measure, and this is used actively in debates today in the U.S. and Me Too and others. By contrast, the other approach is to say, is there active, visible discrimination? Can you say that there are black people who are by an admissions procedure has said, we don't want those black people because we only want white people, or we want more or less, or that we have a quota for Jews, which existed in the U.S. and in many places in the 1940s, and it was officially abolished. The Ivy League schools abolished this. That guy named Clark at Yale, he got together with the other Ivy Leagues and said, well, let's abolish this damn thing. We don't want to have limits on Jews. We want to have other, so he went down to just to add just finish a footnote on that. So he went down to the Bronx High School of Science, top high school in New York, really. And he said, if we get these people, if they come to Yale, they're going to, people are going to have to work harder at Yale to keep up with them. And so then he went to the Bronx High School of Science and said, how far down do we have to go to get some African Americans? Well, maybe 250th. Okay, but the universalistic criterion concern informing that decision was, okay, we're going to have to admit the first 250 people, but it's now going to be 350 because we want all those Jews, and then we want the blacks. And so they both came to Yale together. Whereas now, the term affirmative action is being used in a way that has become ethnic politics. Which is, okay, so so in a sense, the two meanings of discrimination are implied first by counting the number of people who have black faces or Jewish faces, whereas the admissions officer named Clark said, we're not going to discriminate and say we only want 100 blacks. We're going to say we want everybody above a certain level on the test scores. Objective, outside, non-discriminatory. We want, and we explicitly want to overcome the tradition of admitting fewer Jews and fewer people, or give more preference to the children of Yale graduates, so that the children would get ratcheted up a little bit and they're more likely to be admitted. And they abolished that. So the alumni were furious. They said, my children can no longer get special attention. They can't get into Yale anymore. And that's true. So, but he then said, if we're going to do this at Yale, this is a revolution. We can't do this only at Yale. So he went over to people at Harvard, at Princeton, Columbia, and said, the whole Ivy League has got to do this together. And they did. And so there's a book about this. And so Lipset and I started, I try to do this twice, to do at least a paper and maybe a book. First with Lipset, and then second with Daniel Elazar, to talk about the transformation of American elites generally, including this kind of thing in the Ivy League. And my two would-be co-authors, we have a little bit of one draft professional paper, but it's not really published. So it's a sensitive issue, and I'm discussing it just to show you how this sensitive was and is.
And just
Yeah, go
one
ahead.
final question. Based upon what you just said, in the U.S., if you take the college graduates from the elite universities from the top 10, and you look at, for example, in government, right, you will see like 33% of the people in government come from elite universities. If you go then to the UK,
Yes.
of the last 18 prime ministers,
Yes.
16 came from Cambridge or Oxford, and the other one was a military person, and the other one stayed only in office for 30 days. So, and why do you see in the UK, let's say in the Anglo-Saxon world, this elite going all the way to the top, where in Europe, you've done a lot of work in France, that's not the case?
Well, the most visible, I'd say the most important example historically was a book by Seymour Martin Lipset and his German-American co-author Bendix, and they're both at Berkeley together, and it was on international, cross-national comparisons of elites, and so they measured this for the major European countries especially, and I don't know if they had any Asia or not, but they had France, Germany, Spain, Italy, countries like that, compared to the U.S. And the main finding, the simple finding, was they were about the same. So what you're mentioning of the prime ministers of England, I'm sure you're correct.
Yeah.
But the point is, if you took so they broke it down. So you break it down by government, by industry, by type of industry, etc., and so forth. And there are others who now there's later work which goes beyond that. But when they published this is probably the 50s, the early 50s. This was a revolution. People said, this is supposed to be the country of Horatio Alger, and you come to America, then you can take off. Whereas in France, or as you've just cited, only the elites. This is Pierre Bourdieu. The elites are always the elites. The poor people never rise in France. That's the Pierre Bourdieu sociology. And so, Bourdieu had been refuted 20 years before his first book by Lipset and Bendix, and they ignored it. So I was in a grad student, and I knew Bourdieu, and I said, hey, let me back up. Or I met him briefly. I said, I just arrived in Paris. I was working on my PhD field work, and I said, I read your book front to back, and it's intriguing. So this is about a month after the book was published. I just come from New York. Daniel Bell, they sent a copy to Daniel Bell. Daniel Bell gave it to me and said, you're working on France. Will you make a seminar presentation? Tell us about this book, because these people can't. And Bell himself didn't read French very well. So I made a 20-minute, very, very, very critical presentation and I wrote it out, presented it. In Paris, the next month, Bourdieu said, wow, you come here, he said later on, this man, he could have come from the moon, from him, New York or an American, that's the same as the moon, for a close friend, to talk about parochialism. Could have come from the moon or in New York, or whatever. And he'd read our book. So he said, can you, I'll get Passeron, my co-author, come next week and come give us a presentation of what you said. So we had it was a little office. It was about from here over to the wall, and there was one table. It's about as big as this table here, and so I had a decent chair, and and they put me at the table, and the two of them sat in these little rickety old chairs over there, and I had my notes. so I said, am I going to change this? I said, no, I'm just going to say the same things I did in New York, and I did, and they said, they were silent. They'd never heard this kind of criticism of them seriously, you know, and it wasn't impersonal. It wasn't I liked or disliked the authors. You know, I just said it's a bad book, and here's why. And so after that, for I think 7 years, I was the only American sociologist that Bourdieu knew or talked to. And I think I said it in this class. I then said at one point, "You ever want to come to America and see what it's like?" Well, if I would go to America, I would come to tour because I'd really want to talk to Gary Becker. But Gary Becker can't speak French. I can't speak English. So why go to America? So he never did. Okay. All right. So the point is, he and I had lots of discussions, but it was always totally privately. In public, I was, you know, he threw tomatoes at me, you know, in writing all the time. But he loved the real criticism. He knew it was important, and so I mean, so he'd do a new book, and then he'd you know, the next year he'd send another book and say, "See, Terry," he said, "you said you needed propositions. Here's a whole new book, and we have lots of propositions." So I'd read a page. It's a whole page. This messy, sloppy, no clear ideas. This is supposed to be a proposition. So, you know, so I tell them that, you know, you call this a proposition, but it's totally unclear, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I'm giving you this. After 7 years, there are other people began to discover, and so I did the first and only reviews of Bourdieu and Pesarov. I think the four or five books I reviewed in the AJS, the American Sociological Review, or Current Sociology, et cetera, for reviewing books, and so. At that point, and nobody still heard of him. I mean, his first 4 or 5 books, they didn't. Nobody still. He's now the most cited sociologist in the world. At least he was as of a couple of years ago. And that, in a sense, says bad things about the discipline of sociology, I would say. But okay, so I won't go beyond that.
That is more than Foucault and Latour.
Yes.
Yes.
Definitely.
Definitely.
No, I mean earlier. I mean to 20. I mean he read as a student Foucault and Latour and so forth. But I mean one or two may have been simultaneous, but overlapped a bit. But they were a bit more senior. My points here, I guess, when one big one is well, when one the main, I guess this is an elaborate answer to your question, where and why don't we have more? Do we have these English university, Cambridge, Oxford graduates? And for sure, I mean, you have people, political leaders, critics. I'm trying to think if Trump would say this, Biden. That is, certainly there are people from William Jennings Bryan, the famous populist, Midwestern, Southern, small town. He was very critical of the New York, Washington, Boston elite of America, and that I want to be president and I'm going to not use those people, and so forth, and that theme has been. I mean, it goes back before Bryan. It goes back to Thomas Jefferson as president to say America is a country of small farmers, and that's legitimate. And these people who don't know how to do any work with their hands and milk a cow, you know, we don't want them to be our leaders. Okay. So, in that sense, there's a more recent. It's an English book that I've seen. Compared the details of this stuff about England and the U.S. And it basically shows that there are many of the same kinds of institutions are more open and more universalistically recruited in England than in the U.S. So in that sense, look at some of the more serious work on this, and they're interesting differences. Bourdieu's wrong. Well, his own major domestic. Well, I mean, there's a whole industry of critiquing Bourdieu, but it's very simple to criticize what they did in that first book called Les Héritiers. It's the heirs was the title of the book, and it simply basically said the kind of thing that you cited for the elites. But the whole field, it was a major subfield in sociology, was social mobility or social stratification. When I first came here, there were 5 courses called social stratification. Now students are not interested in it. Yeah.
If you compare to, because this was also in our readings, if you compare the European educational system to here, right? There's a big jump in Europe between high school and college, yeah? Where the big jump in the US is from master to PhD. You have a PhD, so that's where the big jump is, yeah? So because the Americans, we read in the readings, they wanted to educate the masses, where in Europe, education is something that makes you elite by itself. Yeah, just the fact that you have a college degree in Europe means a lot more than here. Here, is why is this jump? Who came up with the idea to have that jump from master to PhD?
Good question. Yeah, when you say jump, do you remember the source? What's the source that you seem to be quoting?
Well, back in Europe, right?
No, but is there a book that
Yes,
says that?
I mean,
Which
when
book?
I went to university, all the professors told me that.
No, but I'm asking you,
book.
how do we know? What's this direct evidence that
I don't know, because it came out of the conversations with them. When I said to them I wanted to study in the U.S., they say in the U.S. it's very easy to get into college, but it's very hard to get into a PhD. While in Europe, the difference between a master's degree and a PhD is very thin.
Okay, now,
Yeah.
so that in a sense, you've added that now.
Yeah.
You're saying this is admission to the program.
Yeah.
Where, in contrast to say, I would say that's important, but if you say in terms of the society,
Yeah.
what happened and what kinds of jobs did people take if they got a PhD or an MA or a top elite degree as well? And as I got to know people like Bourdieu, who went to the top, but they were graduates from these top institutions, and I got to know them also at age 40 and 50 and 60. And I would say an important thing to add is the competitiveness of the industries or firms or agencies within Washington, D.C. agencies. They're very competitive with each other. So, I mean, I was in the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, and they would fight with the people from basically the education group. And they do that at age 40 and 50 and 60, and they, whereas many of those elites in France would go into the top government agencies, which basically thought and talked and administered as monopolies. They were not competitive. So in that sense, the competitiveness opened a door for you to rise. Sometimes, so for instance, I don't want to elaborate to try to go into this too much as we're getting away on other things. But I think the big point, which is in a sense is illustrated by the Massachusetts decision in the early 19th century to use education as a criterion, but not only to give you a bit of status, it was to give you the ability to think for yourself and to do things well, and you would perform. Another measure of this in the research frequently in the mid-20th century by social scientists was, what were the subcultures within high schools and types of high schools? And the classic contrast was between the elite private schools, where you would pay lots of money to go to, or your parents would, and the public schools. And the public school boys would be considered achievement oriented. That is, you've got to do well in the test scores, you've got to run faster in the sports and the track, running around, you've got to compete and do well. Whereas the private school boys would dress properly, speak properly, know how to have a raincoat which was tied in the way that the Italians do, and so I had a friend, so he'd say, Terry, you're not tying your raincoat right, etc. Things like, etc. So the two styles were then measured by people like Jim Coleman and Bidwell and so forth for different high schools across the U.S. So, but the visible but the Clark who went from Yale to New York was implementing that, and he was using an achievement-oriented criterion of the public school, and he brought it where Yale and Yale, Harvard, and Princeton still especially had the so-called the clubs, and you could join a club, or to some degree the different version could be a fraternity, and these would have sort of a lifestyle which would define them traditionally. Not being, for instance, the best runner, although some of them would be, say, sports oriented, or would have some kind of other criteria. But the simple distinction is between achievement and symbolic lifestyle, and there were visible, conceptualized, measured kinds of criteria, and the theme of Daniel Elazar in his three types of cultures within the United States, New England was measured more by religion and doing good works in a Calvinist religious manner, and this would be visibly prized as well for political leaders, whereas the Middle Atlantic, the model was Wall Street, doing well, making money as measured by stock prices, whereas the American South was like the private school of lifestyle. I mean, that you would have, and so many people from the South spoke with, many people at Yale have a Southern accent. And William Faulkner, in one of his most famous books, is The Sound and the Fury. The Southern boy goes to Harvard, and he's so alienated by people, looking at the clock all the time. You've got to do it. It's imposed on you. You've got to do it on time, and so forth. And so he takes his thumb and he grinds his thumb into and crushes the glass of his own watch, and he bleeds on his thumb to say, I can't stand this imposition of time against me. It's not me, and etc. So in that sense, these Faulkner I turn to frequently as one of the best, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, writing about Salem, Massachusetts, is the counterpart in New England. And so you can contrast those two novelists, and they each were critics of their own cultures. So Faulkner himself and his character, and some of his lead characters, gave away their slaves when they became 21 years old. They were against slavery. One of the leaders in the town refused to fight in the Civil War, and his daughters hid him away in a back part of the house, big house. And when the Union soldiers, the Northern soldiers, came to their town, they seized this, and it became the military headquarters. But they kept feeding him privately because he was not in the army, fighting against them, and etc. So these kinds of things were used to show, and then there was a paper here by, I don't want to elaborate too much, but there's a recent paper reviewing the journalistic accounts of the institution of hanging if someone is said, you know, he's black, and someone thinks he looked too interestedly at a white woman, he would be hung. Okay, so a group or a crowd would take him if there's a potentially sexual crossing of a line by a black man with a white woman, lynched. That's the term. The lynching. So the lynching is widely discussed in America as, racist, etc. So this is an empirical study. A guy who's a chairman of the Columbia Sociology Department, smart guy. He quantitatively got all the data on lynchings in the history of the American South. Thousands of these, hundreds, whatever. And the majority were not a crowd that lynched him. Most of the cases were tried by the courts and by the local government officials, and most of them released the black men, something like that. So in that sense, the northern people, who the books you read at the University of Chicago, you read about, the Southerners are lynching the blacks. It's terrible. Whereas the data show, no. Okay. So in that sense, and so Faulkner was writing about aspects of the South which you don't get in the rest of, many Southern, anyway. He probes more deeply into the multiple subdimensions within the South, and how these in turn generate the conflict. That is, culture and political culture comes from different themes and people conflicting with each other. And I'm looking at the clock, and we're going over time, so we should end. But I'm ending you with this commentary on a reading of Daniel Elazar to link it to the scenes, including the karaoke booth, showing how the changes in culture are implemented by the Chinese in creative ways, and we then counted the number of these. So we had something like, how many new Chinese amenities did we come up with? 70?
150 or something.
Okay,
yeah.
so 150 amenities either don't exist or do not have a significant meaning in this kind of way, but they're important in China and for Chinese culture and activities in ways that you can measure them. And so they did that, and so this is work in progress by the Chinese, or substantially advancing and transforming the meaning and the measurement of culture and scenes in China. Okay. Thank you, folks, and most of all, thanks to you.
Thank you.